Hi there guys, Vino here and welcome to this Vino Plunk production, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at playing 4K Blu-rays on a 1080p telly. Before we go any further, if you wonder why the frame rate is a little bit slower than it probably normally is, it's because I have to have the frame rate this low in order to sync up for the telly, because movies are played in 24p, if you didn't know. Actually they're playing like 23 point something or rather p, but it's 24p essentially. So if I didn't have this synced up right now, you'd have the rolling shutter kind of effect, and no one likes that. Or in other words, you'll be able to see the frame rate of the TV in real time, and no one likes that, so we can deal with a bit of a slower frame rate in order to sync up with the TV. So when it comes to playing 4K on a 1080p screen, it's quite muddy. In fact, before we get into the research that I've personally done and my own personal experience with enjoying 4K content on a 1080p telly, there's two things I want to get out the way. The very first thing I want to get out the way is this. This is a HDMI cable. This isn't just any HDMI cable, this is a 2.0 or a high-speed HDMI cable. The reason why I mention this, and you notice this is not in the back of the telly right now, and we'll get onto that in a moment, is the amount of people that are running their PlayStation 5s, their Xbox S and X's, their Xbox One S's and One X's without one of these. So the Xbox Series S and X and the PlayStation 5 all come with one of these in the box. So if you're using the HDMI lead you get in the box with any of those consoles, you're fine, you're good to go, off you go. If you've borrowed a HDMI cable from another device, or you've bought one cheaply off of Amazon or something, there's a high chance it's not a high-speed one. If you can see on the, if it'll actually focus for me. Oh lovely, it's not going to focus, but it says high speed on the bottom there, and it's a HDMI 2.0 cable. The reason why you need one of these is because it literally sends more data through to the telly. The telly has to have a HDMI 2.0 port. Most 4K tellies will have that. The device you're sending it from has to have one of those ports. Most modern consoles and 4K players will have that on there, and you need one of these to be able to get the most out of it. So you'll still be able to see the picture and things of that nature. However, the HDR and things of that nature won't work. So that is definitely something that you have to bear in mind when it comes to when you first want to watch 4K content. Make sure you got the right equipment, and make sure you got it in the right USB port, the right HDMI port. That's the second thing I was going to get onto, is some 4K tellies, especially on the cheaper side of things, have different specifications of HDMI ports. HDMI port 1 may be the one that's a 2.0 port, and the rest could be standard HDMI ports, and therefore you're only going to get the 4K niceness out of that first port and not the rest. Make sure you do your research up your particular TV, research up what you need, and off you go. And to be honest, always make sure you buy these from a reputable source. I bought this from Amazon. I say, you know, you may have bought a cheap cable. I actually only paid £2.64 for this cable off of Amazon because it was currently on a clearance deal. They're normally like £7-8 for a cable like this. I paid £2.64. Thank you Hot UK Deals for pointing out that deal, bring that deal to my attention. But yeah, although I do say if you do get a cheaper cable, you can find cables relatively cheap, but all the modern consoles come with a 2.0 HDMI cable in the box, so you're good to go from that point of view. So moving on to HDR. So the vast majority of modern 4K films and things put onto 4K are on the HDR10 standard. So HDR10 is an open source standard. There was a HDR standard before that, and I've completely forgotten what it was called, that wasn't open source. It was actually, you had to pay a license fee. Oh, seagulls outside. You had to pay, there's actually a thunderstorm in the area, so that's probably why they're going a bit crazy, to be honest. Anyway, So there was a HDR standard that was, you had to pay a license fee to whoever came up with it. So HDR10 was actually made as a way of like them being able to get a HDR standard without having to pay someone a license fee. Dolby Atmos, or sorry, Dolby Vision, I do apologise. Dolby Vision is actually based upon the HDR10 protocol, and I don't think you've got to pay that big of a license fee to Dolby in order to use that, because it's based on an open source format. So therefore, you know, they allow people to kind of freely use it. I don't really know the logistics upon that. I do know it's HDR10 based, and I know because of that they can't charge what they normally would. Anyway, that's a bit of red tape and a bit of jargon for another video, maybe. The main thing we're focusing on here is the vast majority of 4K movies nowadays are on the HDR10 standard. The reason why this is quite pertinent to mention is there are 1080p tellies out there that do have HDR, believe it or not. They are out there towards the end of, I think it was just before the 3D era, or just after the 3D era, because that was rather short-lived. To be completely honest with you, they did start releasing HDR 1080p tellies. So there are some 1080p tellies that do have HDR. However, it's not HDR10, because HDR10 is a modern specification for HDR. Therefore, even those 1080p tellies. Now, there are some tellies that do far better with dynamic scaling than other tellies do, and this is where we get into a bit of a muddy area, in that watching a 4K film on a 1080p screen can actually look worse than it does on a 4K screen. One of the reasons is it can just look off, like the frame rate can look a bit off, or the colours can look a bit off, or the range can look a bit off, things of that nature. Now, this is my second 4K player I've owned in my PS5. The first was my Xbox One X. And during having my Xbox One X, I had The Dark Knight Rises. Yes, Dark Knight Rises on 4K. And I watched it a couple of times on 4K. I A and B'd the Blu-ray disc, because it came with a Blu-ray disc, and the 4K disc. And the 4K disc looked drastically better to me, personally, especially, you know, in Blu-ray you get like the glow on the eyes, that sort of stuff. That looked a lot more prominent. The blacks did look just marginally a bit blacker, and things of that nature. I don't know whether it's because my telly does a bit better job with the dynamic scaling and things of that nature. I have no idea. When I put Akira in, I've got it here just as a visual thing. When I put Akira in, it does pop up at the beginning warning you to make sure you connect it up to a TV that does have HDR, basically. So, we've sort of delved into why watching 4K content on a 1080p telly could not work, and why it could look bad, and there are many reasons to that. But what happens if it actually ends up looking good for you? Why does it end up looking good for you? Well, it comes down to the fact that a 4K disc, can simply hold more data than a Blu-ray disc. It also comes down to the fact of the bitrate. So the average bitrate for a DVD is about 10 to maybe 15 push megabits per second. For a Blu-ray, it's 30 to 50. 30 is actually on the upper side, some are about down to 20. Things like the Lord of the Rings extended trilogy are in the 30 range. They look really good on Blu-ray, but some are towards the 20, look a bit rough around the edges. All 4Ks that I've come into contact with are 80 megabits a second bitrate. And what bitrate basically is the amount of data that can be displayed on the screen at any one time. And it makes the screen look crisper. You could record, on my camera right now, I can record at 1080p at 24 megabits, 50 megabits, 100 megabits, whatever I want to do. And the higher that megabit, the better quality it's going to look, despite it still being at 1080p, and when you get to 4K, of course, there are more megabits to play around with because 4K itself has more bandwidth, and that's what we're talking about, bandwidth basically. And that's why The Dark Knight Rises looked better to me on a 1080p 1080p telly, even though I was, you know, watching 4K content downscaled, downsampled on a 1080p telly. Why it still looked good to me? It's because of that bitrate. That bitrate was, you know, almost double, almost triple, if you want to think about it, that of a Blu-ray, and I could see it. I could visually see it. Bitrate is something I am actually quite sensitive to. I notice when things are low in bitrate. You may have seen a YouTube video in which the bitrate just absolutely trashes when there's too much on the screen. That's the other thing, is bitrate can really help when there's a lot of things on the screen. It can help keep a stable image. And that's why some of you may have watched 4K content on a 1080p telly and gone, that actually looks a bit better than the Blu-ray version. That's why bitrate essentially is the reason behind it. However, as I've explained, there are some caveats and it can actually end up looking worse. Just do your research. Do your research on your telly and your setup, and maybe the film that you want to watch. This is my 4K version of Akira. It does come with a Blu-ray as well. I have done a bit of A/B-ing, and again, the colours and the look of it tends to be a bit better for the 4K for me, and that's simply because they probably colour graded differently for the 4K, and my TV can cope with it. That's another thing about when it comes to some TVs and colour coding or colour grading, basically, is that some 1080p tellies can't quite keep up with the colour grading of some 4K films, whereas the Blu-ray has been colour graded to a 1080p standard, the 4K is being colour graded to a 4K standard. I'm probably mucking up the terminology there, but you get what I'm trying to say. I'm just lucky in that I somehow managed to have a telly that copes with it fairly well, but you know, your mileage may vary. I just want to do another video on this because I've actually secured myself a massive 4K set that's coming next week. And one of the reasons why I felt comfortable securing that set, because it's a set I've wanted for a while now. One of the reasons I was comfortable securing that set, because I've actually watched Akira on the 4K now a few times, and on 4K it looks fantastic to me. So we'll see what this other 4K set I've got coming looks like on 4K, and see if with my setup it looks okay. Thank you very much for watching this video, guys. Hopefully this taught you something, you gained something out of it. If you did, put a comment down below, let me know. Give me a like or a dislike, depending on your feelings. Hit that subscribe button, it's big, it's red, it's free. Make sure the quotations are around the bell, and you receive a video, a notification actually, every time I upload a video. But until next time, guys, you take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Ta-ra.